The United States spends more on healthcare per person than any country on Earth. Okinawa spends almost nothing by comparison. And yet the gap in healthy life expectancy between the two is measured in decades. This is not a recent phenomenon. It is not explained by genetics. When researchers studied Japanese Americans in Hawaii who had adopted a Western diet and lifestyle, their disease rates matched the general American population almost exactly. The protection disappeared when the cultural framework disappeared. The genes had not changed. The habits had. What Makoto Suzuki's team found after 40 years of studying over 1,000 Okinawan centenarians was not a population of disciplined health optimizers. It was a population living according to a cultural framework so consistently applied across generations that its health outcomes had become statistically predictable. Sharp cognition at 90. Strong bones at 95. Heart markers that cardiologists associated with people 30 years younger. The framework was not built around food alone. It was built around 5 habits, 2 of which have no dietary component whatsoever, that together produced an outcome no supplement protocol or pharmaceutical intervention has managed to replicate at population scale. Today, I am going to show you all 5. And at the end, I will give you a brief picture of what these people actually eat, because the food and the habits are inseparable, and understanding one without the other misses the most important variable of all. But first, the thing most longevity content gets wrong. The popular framing of Okinawan longevity focuses almost entirely on diet. The purple sweet potato, the miso, the natto, the small fatty fish. These are real variables with real documented mechanisms. But the dietary data from the Okinawa Centenarian Study was never designed to be read in isolation. Suzuki's team consistently noted that the food patterns they documented were embedded in a cultural framework that shaped when, how, why, and with whom food was consumed. Remove the framework and replicate only the food, and you get a partial picture at best. The 5 habits are the framework. The food is what fits inside it. Habit 1. Hara hachi bu. Before every meal in Okinawa, a phrase is spoken at the table. Hara hachi bu. It translates as eat until you are 8 parts full out of 10. Not a rule enforced from outside. A reminder spoken aloud before the first bite that has been part of Okinawan meal culture for as long as the oldest centenarians can remember. The caloric effect is measurable. Stopping at 80% satiety rather than full creates a consistent 10 to 15% caloric deficit without any conscious dietary restriction. No counting, no tracking, no protocol. Just stopping slightly earlier than the signal most modern eaters treat as the cue to finish. The biological mechanism runs deeper than simple caloric reduction. Research on caloric restriction in multiple animal models has consistently demonstrated activation of FOXO3, a longevity gene variant that appears at significantly higher frequencies in the Okinawan centenarian population than in almost any other group ever genotyped. FOXO3 activation enhances cellular repair processes, reduces oxidative stress, and suppresses the inflammatory signaling that drives age-related disease. Hara hachi bu may be a cultural mechanism for activating a genetic longevity pathway, practiced for centuries without any awareness of the molecular biology involved. The Okinawan centenarians were not restricting calories. They were stopping when their cultural training told them to stop. The biology followed automatically. Habit 2. Ikigai. In 2008, a study published in Psychosomatic Medicine followed 43,391 Japanese adults over 7 years. The researchers asked a simple question at baseline: Do you have Ikigai, a sense of purpose, a reason for being, in your life? Those who reported having Ikigai had significantly lower all-cause mortality over the follow-up period. The reduction in cardiovascular mortality was particularly pronounced. Having a reason to wake up in the morning was an independent predictor of survival, even after controlling for age, physical health, and behavioral variables. Ikigai in Okinawa is not a philosophical concept applied abstractly. It is embedded in the daily structure of ordinary life. The elderly woman who tends her garden every morning because her neighbors depend on her vegetables has Ikigai. The man who walks to the community center every afternoon because the younger generation expects his stories has Ikigai. It is not grand ambition. It is daily purpose, specific, social, and tied to the needs of real people who would notice its absence. The mechanism likely runs through the chronic cortisol suppression that accompanies purposeful daily activity. People with a clear reason to get up in the morning wake up differently than those without one. Their hypothalamic, pituitary adrenal axis responds differently to the day's demands. The inflammatory consequences of purposelessness, which the longevity research increasingly documents as a genuine biological variable, simply do not accumulate. The Okinawan centenarians did not schedule their Ikigai. They built their lives around it automatically because their community made purposelessness architecturally difficult. The garden needed tending, the grandchildren needed feeding, the neighbors needed the conversation that only decades of shared history can produce. None of this required motivation. It simply required showing up, which the community made inevitable. Habit 3. Moai. In Okinawa, children are placed into social groups of approximately 5 people at a young age. These groups, called Moai, meet regularly, support each other through difficulties, and in many cases remain together for life. Not as a formal institution, as a cultural expectation that the community reinforces across generations. The longevity research on social connection is among the most consistent in the entire literature. A meta-analysis of 148 studies covering over 300,000 participants found that adequate social relationships were associated with a 50% greater likelihood of survival across the follow-up period. The researchers noted that the effect size was comparable to quitting smoking and exceeded that of physical inactivity, obesity, and excessive alcohol consumption. Social isolation, they found, was associated with mortality risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The Okinawan Moai addresses this variable structurally. It does not leave social connection to individual initiative, the default in modern Western culture, where social bonds must be actively maintained against the competing demands of work, screens, and geographic mobility. The Moai makes connection the default and isolation the exception. 5 people who have known each other for decades, who notice when someone is absent, who show up without being asked, that's as. When one Moai member falls ill, the others appear at the door with food. When one faces financial hardship, the group contributes. The psychological security of knowing that 5 people are structurally committed to your survival changes how the nervous system responds to daily stress in ways that individual resilience practices cannot fully replicate. Before Habit 4, if this kind of research is useful to you, subscribe to Longevity Code. Every week we decode one blue zone, one population, one system. Always peer-reviewed, always practical. Always something specific you can start this week. Habit 4. The afternoon rest. Every afternoon in Okinawa, after the midday meal, activity stops. Not everywhere and not always, but consistently enough across the centenarian population that Suzuki's research team identified it as a dietary adjacent variable worth documenting. The body stops moving, the demands of the day are suspended, the parasympathetic nervous system is allowed to dominate for 20 to 30 minutes without competition. A 2007 study of 23,000 people, published in the Archives of Internal Medicine, found that regular afternoon nappers had a 37% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared to non-nappers. The effect was strongest in working men, the group with the highest chronic stress burden, but present across all demographic categories studied. The mechanism is not mystery. During the parasympathetic state, heart rate slows, cortisol drops, digestive enzyme activity increases, and the cellular repair processes that stress hormones suppress are allowed to operate. The body does what it does best when demand is removed from it. A daily reset of this kind, practiced consistently across a lifetime rather than occasionally when exhaustion becomes unavoidable, produces a chronically different cortisol baseline than the continuous activation that characterizes modern working life. The Okinawan centenarians were not napping because they had read the cardiovascular research. They were resting after lunch because that was when the day's heat made work impractical and the culture made rest normal. The biology simply reflected what a twice-daily parasympathetic reset looks like across 90 years of consistent practice. Habit 5. What they actually eat. A brief picture. The 4 habits above would produce limited outcomes in a body being systematically damaged by ultra-processed food, refined sugar, and seed oil-dominated cooking. The cultural framework works because the food that operates inside it supports rather than undermines the biological processes the habits are protecting. The Okinawan dietary pattern is not complicated. Purple sweet potato forms the caloric base, a carbohydrate with a glycemic index of 44 that never produces the post-meal glucose spikes that damage arterial walls over decades. Tofu and fermented soy, miso, natto provide protein alongside isoflavones, vitamin K, 2, and the probiotic ecosystem that maintains the gut barrier integrity underlying every other health outcome. Small fatty fish consumed several times weekly deliver the preformed D, HA, and EPA that support both cardiovascular and neurological function. Seaweed provides iodine, fucoidans, and minerals that the rocky Okinawan soil cannot. Green tea consumed throughout the day delivers EGCG and L-theanine, a combination that reduces neuroinflammation and supports the cognitive function the Ikigai and Moai habits depend on. What is almost entirely absent is what matters as much as what is present. No ultra-processed food. No refined sugar consumed habitually. No seed oils. Very little red meat, eaten on special occasions, not as a daily staple. The food is simple, local, prepared at home, and consumed in the small portions that Hara hachi makes automatic. This is not a diet. It is what eating looks like when a cultural framework has shaped it for generations without industrial food ever disrupting the baseline. The United States spends more on healthcare per person than any country on Earth. Okinawa spends almost nothing by comparison. The gap is not closed by better hospitals or more advanced pharmaceuticals. It was built, meal by meal and morning by morning, across the lifetimes of people who never knew they were doing anything remarkable. They were just living the way their community had always lived. Which of these 5 habits could you realistically introduce into your daily life starting this week? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to Longevity Code. Next week, another blue zone, another framework, another system that produced outcomes the wealthiest healthcare systems on Earth are still struggling to replicate. Always the science. always something you can start this week.